V. Sarah Martinez had always been a good shot. Growing up on her grandfather's ranch in Texas, she learned to handle rifles before she could properly tie her shoes. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran, taught her that shooting wasn't just about pulling a trigger. It was about patience, breathing, and respect for the weapon. When Sarah joined the Army at 19, she thought her shooting skills would be an advantage. She imagined earning respect quickly and proving herself among her peers. What she didn't expect was the wall of hostility she would face from some of the male soldiers in her unit. The trouble started on her first day at the firing range. Fort Carson's outdoor range stretched across several acres of Colorado wilderness, with targets set at various distances. The morning air was crisp, and Sarah felt confident as she carried her M4 carbine to her assigned position. "Look what we got here," muttered Corporal Jake Henderson, a stocky man with close-cropped hair and cold blue eyes. He had been in the Army for 3 years and considered himself one of the better marksmen in the company. Another girl trying to play soldier. Sarah pretended not to hear him. She focused on setting up her equipment and checking her rifle. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, a result of countless hours spent with her grandfather learning proper weapon handling. "I bet she can't even hit the broadside of a barn," whispered Private First Class Tony Rivera to Henderson. Rivera was newer to the Army, but eager to impress the more experienced soldiers. He laughed quietly at his own joke. The range instructor, Sergeant Williams, called for attention. He was a no-nonsense man in his 40s who had served multiple tours overseas. His weathered face showed the stress of years in combat zones. "Today we're qualifying on the M4, Williams announced. "You need to hit 36 out of 40 targets to pass. Anyone who fails will repeat this exercise until they succeed." Sarah took her position on the firing line. She could feel the eyes of several male soldiers on her, waiting for her to fail. The pressure was intense, but she remembered her grandfather's words about staying calm under stress. Henderson positioned himself 2 spots to Sarah's left. He made sure to speak loud enough for her to hear. "I wonder if she'll cry when she misses every shot." Rivera, stationed to Henderson's left, chuckled. "Maybe we should have gotten her a smaller gun. This one might be too heavy for her." Other soldiers nearby began to snicker. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. She wanted to turn around and confront them, but she knew that would only make things worse. "Shooters, prepare your weapons," Sergeant Williams commanded. Sarah loaded her magazine with steady hands. Despite the comments around her, she felt her training take over. Her grandfather had taught her to block out distractions, to find that quiet space in her mind where only she and the target existed. "Ready on the left, ready on the right, ready on the firing line," Williams called out. The first targets appeared at 50 meters. Sarah controlled her breathing, just like her grandfather taught her. She squeezed the trigger slowly, feeling the familiar kick of the rifle against her shoulder. Her first shot hit dead center. Henderson glanced over at her target, his expression showing surprise. He had expected her to struggle immediately. "Lucky shot," he muttered. But Sarah's second shot was also a bullseye. Then her third. Her steady performance began to attract attention from other soldiers on the line. As the targets moved to longer distances, the comments from Henderson and Rivera became more pointed. "She's probably cheating somehow," Rivera whispered during a brief pause. "Yeah, there's no way a girl can shoot that well," Henderson agreed. "Someone must have given her special ammunition or something." Sarah tried to ignore them, but their words were getting under her skin. Her fourth shot at the 100-meter target missed the center ring by inches. "There it is," Henderson said with satisfaction. "I knew she couldn't keep it up." The harassment continued throughout the morning. Every time Sarah made an excellent shot, Henderson and Rivera found ways to diminish her achievement. When she occasionally missed the center ring, they acted as if it proved their point about women being unfit for military service. Other soldiers began to join in the commentary. What started as whispered comments became more open mockery. Sarah found herself surrounded by doubt and hostility, even as her shooting remained consistently strong. By lunch break, Sarah had qualified easily, but the emotional toll was heavy. She sat alone, questioning whether she belonged in this environment. The afternoon session brought even more challenges for Sarah. Word had spread through the company about the new female soldier who could actually shoot. Some soldiers were genuinely impressed, but others seemed threatened by her abilities. Henderson had gathered a small group of supporters around him during lunch. They returned to the range with a plan to rattle Sarah's confidence even more. "Hey, Martinez," Henderson called out as she prepared for the afternoon qualification. "My grandmother could shoot better than you, and she's been dead for 10 years. The group around him erupted in laughter. Sarah's face reddened, but she continued preparing her equipment. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, a quiet soldier who had been watching the harassment all morning, felt uncomfortable with what he was seeing. He had a younger sister back home and couldn't imagine treating any woman the way Henderson was treating Sarah. "Maybe you should ease up on her," Johnson suggested quietly to Henderson. Henderson turned on him with fury. "What's wrong with you, Johnson? You gonna defend her? She doesn't belong here, and someone needs to tell her." Johnson backed down, not wanting to become a target himself. The pressure to fit in with the group was strong, especially for younger soldiers trying to establish themselves in the unit. Sergeant Williams noticed the tension, but decided to let the soldiers work it out among themselves, as long as it didn't interfere with the training. He had seen similar situations before and believed that military life would naturally sort out who belonged and who didn't. The afternoon targets were set at longer distances, starting at 200 meters and extending out to 300. These shots required more skill and concentration. Sarah knew this was where her grandfather's training would really be tested. As she settled into position for her first long-range shot, Henderson began a new tactic. He started talking loudly about women in combat, making sure his voice carried across the firing line. "I read somewhere that women can't handle the stress of real combat," he announced to his friends. "Something about their brains being wired differently." Rivera picked up the theme. "Yeah, and they get emotional at the worst times. Imagine being in a firefight and having to worry about whether your teammate is going to have a breakdown." Sarah tried to block out their voices, but the words cut deep. These weren't just casual insults anymore. They were attacking her capability as a soldier and her worth as a teammate. Her first shot, at 200 meters, missed the target entirely. Henderson saw this and smiled with satisfaction. "See? I told you she couldn't handle it when it really matters." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. Missing the target completely was embarrassing, especially after her strong morning performance. She could hear murmurs from other soldiers along the line. "Focus," she whispered to herself, remembering her grandfather's voice. "Don't let them get in your head." She adjusted her sight picture and controlled her breathing. Her second shot hit the target, though not in the center ring. "Lucky shot number 2, Henderson called out. As Sarah continued shooting, Henderson and his group kept up their commentary. They questioned her physical strength, her mental toughness, and her right to be there. With each comment, Sarah felt her confidence slipping away. Private Johnson watched the harassment continue and felt increasingly uncomfortable. He noticed that Sergeant Williams seemed to be ignoring what was happening, either because he didn't hear it or because he chose not to intervene. During a brief break between firing positions, Johnson approached Sarah. "Don't let them get to you," he said quietly. "You're a good shot." Sarah looked at him with surprise. It was the first supportive word she had heard all day from anyone in her unit. "Thanks," she replied, grateful for even this small gesture of solidarity. Henderson noticed the interaction and immediately targeted Johnson. "What are you doing, Johnson? You trying to be her boyfriend or something?" Johnson's face turned red, and he quickly moved away from Sarah. The fear of being associated with her and becoming a target himself was too strong. Sarah felt more alone than ever. Even the one person who had shown her kindness was afraid to stand by her when confronted. The harassment escalated as the afternoon wore on. Henderson began making crude comments about women's capabilities in general. Rivera joined in with jokes about Sarah's appearance and her family background. Other soldiers who might have spoken up remained silent, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves. The group dynamics of military units often create situations where harassment can continue unchecked because no one wants to stand out or challenge the established pecking order. Sarah's shooting began to suffer noticeably. Her group spread wider, and she missed several targets that should have been easy shots for someone of her skill level. "Look at that," Henderson announced after one of her misses. "She's falling apart under pressure. What's going to happen when bullets are flying back at her?" By the end of the afternoon, Sarah had barely qualified for the longer distances. Her earlier strong performance seemed like a distant memory. She felt defeated and questioned whether she had made a mistake joining the army. As the soldiers prepared to leave the range, Henderson made one final comment loud enough for everyone to hear. "I hope they don't put her in my squad when we deploy. I don't want to depend on someone who cracks under pressure." The next morning brought no relief for Sarah. Word of the previous day's events had spread throughout the company, and she found herself the subject of conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. At breakfast, she sat alone while other soldiers clustered together at nearby tables. She could hear fragments of their discussions about her performance and whether women should be allowed in combat roles. Corporal Henderson had become emboldened by the apparent support from his peers. He saw Sarah's isolation as validation of his campaign against her. During morning formation, he made sure to position himself where his comments would be heard by as many soldiers as possible. "I heard we're supposed to trust our lives to people who can't even handle a little pressure at the range," he said loud enough for Sarah to hear. Captain Rodriguez, the company commander, stood at the front of the formation going through the daily announcements. He was a career officer focused on preparing his unit for an upcoming deployment to Afghanistan. Personnel issues between soldiers were something he preferred to let his non-commissioned officers handle. After formation, the company was scheduled to return to the range for advanced marksmanship training. Sarah dreaded facing another day of harassment, but she knew she had no choice. Quitting or complaining would only confirm what Henderson and others believed about women in the military. Sergeant Williams gathered the soldiers around him at the range. Today's training would focus on shooting from different positions and engaging multiple targets quickly. These skills were essential for combat situations. "Today we're going to test your ability to adapt and perform under stress," Williams announced. "You'll be shooting from prone, kneeling, and standing positions. You'll also engage targets that appear for only a few seconds." Henderson saw this as another opportunity to break Sarah's confidence. As the soldiers moved to their positions, he began a new round of psychological warfare. "I wonder if she knows which end of the rifle the bullets come out of," he said to Rivera, making sure Sarah could hear. Rivera laughed and added his own comment. "Maybe someone should explain to her that the targets are supposed to be downrange, not behind her." Other soldiers who had remained neutral the day before began to join in the laughter. The group mentality was taking hold, where participating in the harassment felt safer than standing against it. Private Johnson watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. He had spent the previous evening thinking about his younger sister and how he would feel if she faced this kind of treatment. He wanted to speak up, but the fear of becoming an outcast in his unit held him back. Sarah took her position for the first exercise, shooting from the prone position. The targets would appear at various distances and remain visible for only 5 seconds each. It was a challenging exercise, even for experienced marksmen. As she settled into position, Henderson began providing loud commentary on her technique. "Look at that stance," he announced. "She's holding the rifle like it's going to bite her." Sarah tried to ignore him and focus on the first target that appeared at 100 meters. She acquired the target quickly and fired. The shot hit the center ring. "Lucky again," Henderson said dismissively. "Let's see if she can do it twice." The second target appeared at 200 meters. Sarah smoothly transitioned her aim and fired. Another hit. Henderson's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. Anyone can hit a stationary target. Let's see what happens when things get real. As the exercise continued, Sarah began to find her rhythm despite the harassment. Her grandfather's training was deeply ingrained, and muscle memory took over when her conscious mind was under stress. Target after target fell to her accurate fire. The other soldiers on the line began to notice her consistent performance, and some of the commentary started to die down. Henderson, realizing that his psychological tactics weren't working as well as before, decided to escalate his approach. "Hey Martinez," he called out during a brief pause. "I heard your daddy had to teach you to shoot because you were too weak to learn it in basic training." Sarah's jaw tightened. Henderson had crossed the line by bringing her family into his attacks. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot, not her father, but the intent behind Henderson's words was clear. "Is that true?" Rivera chimed in. "Did you need special help because you couldn't keep up with the men?" The lie was obviously designed to humiliate her and suggest that she had received unfair advantages. Sarah felt her anger building, but she forced herself to remain focused on the training. The next phase of the exercise involved shooting from the kneeling position. This required more stability and control, as the shooter had less contact with the ground for support. Henderson positioned himself closer to Sarah, claiming he needed to adjust his equipment. In reality, he wanted to be close enough to whisper directly in her ear during the shooting. As Sarah prepared for the first target, Henderson leaned slightly toward her. "You know everyone's watching you fail, right?" he whispered. "They're all waiting for you to prove that women don't belong here." Sarah's first shot from the kneeling position missed the target entirely. Henderson smiled with satisfaction. "There it is," he announced loudly. "I knew she couldn't handle the pressure." The miss shook Sarah's confidence more than she wanted to admit. She had been shooting well despite the harassment, but Henderson's psychological pressure was finally beginning to show results. Her second shot barely clipped the edge of the target. Henderson continued his quiet commentary, designed to be heard only by Sarah, but timed to distract her at crucial moments. Private Johnson could see what was happening and felt sick to his stomach. He knew that Henderson's behavior was wrong, but he also knew that speaking up would make him a target. The military's emphasis on unit cohesion often created situations where bullying could flourish unchecked. As Sarah struggled through the kneeling portion of the exercise, her shooting became increasingly erratic. Henderson had found the right combination of timing and content to disrupt her concentration. The harassment reached its peak during the standing position exercises. Standing shots are the most difficult, requiring exceptional balance and muscle control. Henderson knew this was his best chance to completely break Sarah's confidence. As she prepared for the standing portion, Henderson positioned himself where his voice would carry across the range. He had gathered his usual supporters around him, creating an audience for his performance. "I bet she falls over from the recoil," he announced loudly. "Standing position requires actual upper body strength." Rivera laughed and added, "Maybe we should get her a tripod to help her hold the rifle up." Sarah felt the weight of everyone's attention as she took her stance. The standing position required her to support the entire weight of the rifle while maintaining precise aim. Her grandfather had taught her this position using old techniques that emphasized natural balance rather than artificial support. The first target appeared at 150 meters. Sarah raised her rifle and tried to find her natural point of aim. Henderson chose that moment to speak. "Look at those arms shaking," he called out. "She can't even hold the rifle steady." Sarah's shot went wide, missing the target by several inches. The miss drew murmurs from other soldiers along the firing line. Henderson sensed victory and pressed his advantage. "See, I told you she didn't have the strength for this. Real soldiers don't shake like that." Sarah felt humiliation wash over her. Her arms had been steady, but Henderson's comment made her suddenly conscious of every small movement. Self-doubt crept into her mind. The second target appeared, and Sarah tried to regain her composure. She focused on her grandfather's voice in her memory, reminding her about breathing and natural point of aim. "Breathe," she whispered to herself. Henderson heard her whisper and pounced on it. Is she talking to herself now? That's what happens when the pressure gets too much. Sarah's second shot was better, hitting the outer ring of the target. It wasn't a great shot, but it was on target. "Lucky shot number 3, Henderson said dismissively. Unknown to the soldiers on the firing line, General Patricia Hayes had arrived at Fort Carson for an unscheduled inspection of training activities. General Hayes was a 2-star general who had worked her way up through the ranks over 25 years of service. She had faced her own share of discrimination and harassment during her career. The general's aide had suggested they observe marksmanship training as part of their visit. They approached the range from behind the firing line, where they could observe the soldiers without being noticed. General Hayes immediately noticed the tension among the soldiers. Her experience, I could spot unit dynamics and morale issues from a distance. What she heard as they got closer made her blood boil. "I don't know why they waste time training women," Henderson was saying to his group. "They're just going to quit when things get tough anyway." Sarah was preparing for her third standing shot when Henderson decided to launch his most personal attack yet. "I heard Martinez only joined the army because she couldn't get a real job," he announced loudly. "Probably couldn't even get a man to marry her, so she had to come here and pretend to be one of us." The comment was so cruel and personal that even some of Henderson's supporters looked uncomfortable. Private Johnson felt his face burn with shame for his unit and his own silence. Sarah's hands began to tremble with rage rather than nerves. Henderson's attack on her character and personal life crossed every line of military professionalism. She wanted to turn around and confront him, but she knew that would only give him more ammunition. General Hayes had heard enough. She recognized the systematic harassment she was witnessing and knew it had to be stopped immediately. Her own experiences as a young officer facing similar treatment had taught her the importance of decisive leadership in these situations. The general began walking toward the firing line, her aide hurrying to keep up. Her expression was thunderous, and her military bearing commanded attention. Sergeant Williams was the first to notice the approaching officers. His eyes widened as he recognized the 2 stars on General Hayes' uniform. He quickly called the range to attention. "Range halt! General officer on deck." The announcement sent shock waves through the soldiers. They immediately stopped what they were doing and snapped to attention. Henderson, who had been in the middle of another cruel comment about Sarah, felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. General Hayes walked slowly along the firing line, her eyes taking in every detail of the scene. She had arrived at the perfect moment to witness Henderson's harassment firsthand. The range fell completely silent except for the sound of the general's boots on the gravel. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as she surveyed the soldiers standing at rigid attention. Sarah remained in the standing firing position, her rifle still aimed downrange. She didn't know whether to lower her weapon or maintain her stance until given specific orders. General Hayes stopped directly behind Henderson. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers in combat. "Corporal Henderson," she said, reading his name tape. "Step forward." Henderson's face had gone completely pale. He moved forward on unsteady legs, knowing that his military career was probably about to end. General Hayes looked him in the eyes with an expression that could have melted steel. "Soldier, I have been standing behind this firing line for the past 10 minutes. Would you like to repeat for me what you've been saying about Specialist Martinez?" Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He knew there was no explanation that would save him from the consequences of what the general had witnessed. We were just, he stammered. "You were just what, Corporal?" The general's voice cut through his attempted explanation like a sword. General Hayes let the silence stretch for what felt like an eternity. Henderson stood frozen, unable to form a coherent response. Every soldier on the firing line could feel the tension in the air. "Since you seem to have lost your voice, Corporal, let me tell you what I heard," the general said, her voice carrying clearly across the range. "I heard you questioning Specialist Martinez's strength, her qualifications, her personal life, and her right to serve in this army." Henderson's face had turned from pale to red with shame. He stared straight ahead, not daring to meet the general's eyes. General Hayes turned her attention to the other soldiers. "I also heard several of you laughing at and encouraging this behavior. You seem to find it entertaining to tear down one of your fellow soldiers." She walked slowly along the line, making eye contact with each soldier who had participated in harassment. Rivera, who had been one of Henderson's most vocal supporters, looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "Specialist Martinez, the general called out. Sarah lowered her rifle and turned around, snapping to attention. Yes, ma'am. Approach me, please. Sarah walked over to where the general stood, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure if she was in trouble for not reporting the harassment or if the general wanted to hear her side of the story. General Hayes studied Sarah for a moment, taking in her bearing and composure despite the stress she had been under. Specialist Martinez, how long have you been shooting? The general asked. Since I was 7 years old, ma'am. My grandfather taught me on his ranch in Texas. And what was your score yesterday on the qualification course? Sarah hesitated, not sure why the general was asking. 39 out of 40, ma'am. A murmur ran through the soldiers. Even Henderson looked surprised. He had been so focused on harassing Sarah that he hadn't paid attention to her actual scores. General Hayes nodded approvingly. Outstanding. And what about today's exercises? Sarah glanced at her scorecard. I was struggling with the standing position, ma'am. I've hit 6 out of 8 targets so far. 6 out of 8 under these circumstances, the general said, her voice rising so everyone could hear, is exceptional performance. Most soldiers would have fallen apart completely under the kind of harassment you've been enduring. She turned back to face Henderson and the other soldiers. Let me tell you something about Specialist Martinez's performance. Yesterday, she shot the second highest score in your entire company. Today, despite being systematically harassed and undermined by her fellow soldiers, she is still performing better than most of you. The weight of the general's words settled over the soldiers like a heavy blanket. Many of them had assumed Sarah was struggling because she lacked ability, not because of the pressure they had created. General Hayes wasn't finished. Corporal Henderson, you questioned Specialist Martinez's strength and qualifications. Let me ask you something. What was your qualification score yesterday? Henderson's voice was barely a whisper. 34, ma'am. 34, the general repeated loudly. 5 points lower than the soldier you've been claiming isn't qualified to be here. The comparison was devastating. Henderson had spent 2 days tearing down Sarah's confidence while performing worse than her himself. General Hayes turned to address the entire group. I've served in this army for 25 years. I've commanded soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen courage and cowardice, strength and weakness, competence and incompetence. And I can tell you that what I witnessed here today was not strength. She paused to let her words sink in. Real strength is not tearing down your fellow soldiers. Real strength is lifting them up, supporting them, and helping them succeed. What I saw here was weakness disguised as machismo. Private Johnson felt tears forming in his eyes. The general's words cut right to his heart because he knew he had been weak. He had known the harassment was wrong, but had been too afraid to speak up. General Hayes continued her assessment. In combat, your life depends on the soldier next to you. That soldier might be male or female, black or white, Christian or Muslim, from the city or the country. None of that matters when bullets are flying. What matters is competence, courage, and loyalty to each other. She walked over to Sarah again. Specialist Martinez, I want you to complete the standing exercise. I want to see what you can do when you're not being harassed by soldiers who should be supporting you. Sarah nodded and returned to the firing line. The range was completely silent now, except for the sound of wind and the distant noise of other training activities. General Hayes positioned herself where she could observe both Sarah and the other soldiers. Range is hot. You may commence firing when ready. Sarah took her stance and focused on the target that appeared downrange. For the first time in 2 days, the firing line was completely quiet. No harassment, no cruel comments, no psychological pressure from her fellow soldiers. She found her natural point of aim, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The shot hit dead center. The next target appeared at 200 meters. Sarah smoothly transitioned her aim and fired again. Another perfect hit. Target after target appeared, and Sarah engaged each one with precision and confidence. Her natural shooting ability, freed from the harassment that had been breaking her concentration, showed itself clearly. When the exercise was complete, Sarah had hit 8 out of 8 targets from the standing position. It was a performance that would have been impressive even under ideal conditions. General Hayes nodded with satisfaction. Outstanding shooting, Specialist Martinez. She turned to face the rest of the soldiers. This is what happens when soldiers support each other instead of tearing each other down. This is the standard I expect from every unit in this army. Henderson and his supporters looked defeated. Their campaign to prove that Sarah didn't belong had instead proven their own inadequacy as leaders and teammates. General Hayes walked over to Henderson one final time. Corporal Henderson, you and I are going to have a long conversation with your chain of command about leadership, respect, and military values. Your behavior here is unacceptable and will have consequences. She then addressed the entire group. The rest of you need to think seriously about what kind of soldiers you want to be. You can be part of the problem or part of the solution. Today, most of you chose to be part of the problem. As the general prepared to leave, she stopped next to Sarah. Specialist Martinez, you've shown exceptional skill and composure under pressure. That's exactly the kind of soldier this army needs. Sarah felt a mixture of relief, vindication, and pride. The harassment wasn't over, and she knew she would face more challenges ahead, but now she had proof that her abilities were recognized at the highest levels. General Hayes walked away from the range, leaving behind a group of soldiers who had learned an important lesson about respect, competence, and what it really means to be strong.